Saba Shariff, Head of New Product Development and Corporate Strategy at Symcor. Darren Fung, CTO at Drop Technologies. And Franklin Garrigues, Vice President, External Ecosystems at TD. Welcome. Unfortunately, Rami Thabat will not be able to join us today due to a personal emergency. But before we get started, let's recap quickly. It's been 4 years since Budget 2018, where the government announced its intention to review the merit of open banking. It appointed an advisory committee and 2 rounds of consultation later, which culminated in a final report of the Open Banking Advisory Committee recommending a Made in Canada approach to open banking be implemented in Canada. Now, we do have a newly appointed open banking lead that will be implementing this Made in Canada approach here for us. You've heard earlier today your lead as well give us some of his thoughts as to how he plans on going about it, and we'll have some further discussion on that as well today. But open banking at its heart is about empowering the consumer. So my first question to the panel is, what do you believe value will actually look like for the consumer? Darren, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for the introduction. There's 2 things that I think about when I think about value for the consumer. The first is actually very simple and very core to open banking. And you wouldn't really see this as, as a consumer, as this as actually being value. But on the other side, I really think this is one of the core reasons why open banking is so important. And that's really around security and privacy for our consumers, Canadian consumers, but also consistency and just putting more control into the hands of the consumer of the data that is at the end of the day should feel like it's their data and it's the consumer's data. Outside of that, with the introduction of any sort of open banking framework or more buy-in from the banks, it's really having a solution that brings forward more players to build on top of these solutions, on top of these APIs. And so, value in that sense is really limited only by the creativity of what entrepreneurs can really think of. And so, it could be more services like what Drop would provide, or more financial products in the market for the Canadian consumer that may not have been sort of feasible or consistent enough or secure enough without these solutions. And so on the other side, as one of these fintechs that's building on top of these soon-to-be solutions, that's really where we see a lot of that value being given back to the consumer.
Thank you for that. Saba?
Yeah, I mean, I love where you started with that, Darren, because that ultimately, if we can have some consistency, value for the consumer goes beyond perhaps open banking one day. And it goes to really, the central issue of what is my data? What am I allowed to do with my data? What services can I actually get? Because to Darren's point, value is ultimately defined by the service that comes out of open banking. Now, value is not going to occur if customers don't trust sharing their data with third parties. So that's going to be very important to consider what that's going to look like. And there's actually some really interesting analysis right now happening on, because we're talking about a Made in Canada solution, how willing are Canadians to share their data with third parties? What needs to be in place for them to share that data with third parties? And so unlocking the value is going to require, and I know we're going to talk about it later in the panel, a number of steps that are going to help engender more trust in the ecosystem, and has to have the right, I would say, incentives in place for Canadians to be comfortable with sharing their data. Because right now, although many have elected to use screen scraping, because that's the only option that they have is to consent to that, ideally we're moving to a more secure means. Now, getting them over that hump and making sure that they understand that and actually do that, I think is going to be important. And then there's certainly the services that Darren's company offers as an example, for loyalty and rewards that are great. There's a really neat one that's happening in the UK as well, that real estate organizations are doing. They're taking a look at where you shop and where what businesses you frequent. And based on that, they're recommending neighborhoods for you to live in. Now, maybe not an option in Canada because no one can afford to buy a house, but only open banking can solve that issue.
With real estate anyway, so.
Exactly. So, if we at least knew where we could maybe afford to live, that would help as a start. But there's definitely lots of neat little innovative services that I think can come from open banking.
Sure. Franklin?
Saba, Parna, you're starting with the right question, which is what's in it for the consumers, and we've seen customers asking for open banking for a while, and they don't ask for open banking, but we see the interest for services that leverage open banking or equivalent for a while. We call it the data democratization. It's a movement, and we believe it's happening. So, open banking will, enable a lot of financial services like enhanced credit decisioning or, easier onboarding. That's very bank centric. It will, I think, where it gets really exciting is beyond that. Open banking is the beginning of a new era where you have, platform, embedded banking, and other services that are much more integrated. And it really starts to transform the experience of not just banking or verticals, but the way we experience things. So it's the beginning. I would say open banking is the infrastructure that's going to really enable a lot of the future of banking and a much more integrated financial services into our everyday life.
Thank you. It's for sure a new era. And as we embark on this new era, we've been talking about Made in Canada, which has really become a buzzword. But what principles do you believe a Made in Canada solution really should have? And what should really differentiate this Canadian model from some of the other models that's been adopted in the other jurisdictions that have gone before us? Saba?
Yeah, we get to the hard questions out of the way. Parna, maybe the other questions are easier, but
it's the topic.
It's the topic. It is the agenda. So what does that look like? I think, other panelists have talked about it as well. It first starts with understanding what were those other models? So from my perspective, there's probably three. There's certainly the heavy regulatory driven approach. All this started in the EU and the UK for various reasons. There's a fully market driven approach, which I think is largely what's happening in the US, right? There isn't something that's been written, despite the president's directive. And then there's more of a hybrid approach that you're going to see in jurisdictions like Singapore. So for those of you who heard the fireside chat with Abraham this morning, I was very heartened to hear his recognition that the conditions that led to open banking in other areas are not necessarily the same conditions that exist in Canada today. And I think the words that he used was, we have to have a pragmatic approach, one that looks at the context of the systems that were developed and what need to be developed here in Canada, which I completely agree with. So I think that starts first with understanding what's happened elsewhere, what can we take from those jurisdictions, and what should we avoid, right? Like what are the contexts that we should avoid? So in terms of the things that I think we have to be very careful in considering and in ensuring don't necessarily occur in Canada there were differences in customer experience. So without that standard really being applied to how customers are granting their consent, how they're connecting to different applications, that led to a lot of friction and drop off. So people associated that with this, the new open banking system. And that was simply because there was a lack of consistency in how they were getting connected. I think the question of the lack of, let's say, reciprocity out of the gate. So if it's an uneven system where there's federal organizations that are treated differently than provincial organizations, as an example, that's going to lead to more confusion and challenges for consumers when what we're trying to do is make this a lot easier for them. So those are important considerations to keep in mind. I think another important one is just if we look at what was realized and when it was realized and how much it costs to be realized in other markets, those are things that we ultimately should look to avoid. If our goal is innovation, if the goal is democratization of data, as Franklin mentioned, and we shouldn't be spending 3, 4, 5 years to get this done. We shouldn't be spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get this done. And so this is where industry, I believe, is going to need to collaborate and work together, not only amongst each other, as they've already started to do in areas like FDX and the CIO Strategy Council, but also collaborate with government. And I really like some of the learnings from the Singaporean model that are coming to light, which was very much about the government creating an ecosystem that encouraged collaboration. It encouraged banks to move. They started with something as simple as an API playbook. Here's the standards. Here's 400 different APIs. Here's the guidelines that you should look to apply if you're going to make your APIs and the customer data accessible. And it's been more encouraging versus a mandate that says here's a very prescriptive timeline or expectation. Doesn't always solve for some of the work that's going to have to happen. I think industry is going to have to play a role as they've done. But I definitely think that there's something to be learned, and at least in the advisory committee report, we saw very much this talk of a hybrid solution. And for me, that's what the hybrid solution looks like. It's the necessary support for industry to move forward and collaborate and get some real things done.
Franklin?
Very much aligned with you, Saba. I feel the Canadian. What are the principles in the Canadian market? and I'm going to take it where you left it, which is the report from the advisory committee, is doing a great job laying out a very balanced approach. And I think that that's the key principle, to be balanced between, there's a lot of things to balance here, right? Like convenience versus security. It has to find the right balancing act between the two. It's all about the consumer or the customer at the end. And so we have to collectively balance the interest of the data providers and the data recipients. We're all looking at it from our own lens, but at the end, success will be consumers will find what they need. And so we need to balance these interests, as well as balancing speed versus perfection. Let's be pragmatic. I think that's the key word, being pragmatic. I could add a few principles and think of, we like the principle of industry-led solutions with a regulator, legislator playing a bit of a principal approach or principal role, where they set the framework, but then it's developed and designed and delivered by industry. We feel that's a way to achieve this balancing act. And also a comment in passing that Canada needs a Canadian solution. We're very close to and integrated into the US market. That's the reality of a lot of our businesses, banks and non-banks. And so whatever we do has to be interoperable and keeping in mind that we all interact, or most of us interact on both sides of the border. This would be my few notes here.
Thanks, Franklin. Darren?
Yeah, and I think what's important is for us to acknowledge that, it is a different market, right? We can't just take one model from one country and apply it without really thinking about the implications of that in Canada, because it's just comparing apples to oranges. And I like that we called out the US is on one extreme, and hopefully we're going to be somewhere in the middle, because one of those advantages that I see, Drop is a company that does business in the US, and we now have experience with how that their decision to make it a sort of market-driven approach has affected fintechs like us. And one of the big differences between Canada and the US is just in terms of the market share of the long tail there, and the market share over here is so much more different. So without a sort of more strong approach to adopting an open banking framework, we're just not able to capture a lot of the US market if they're using sort of state-run credit unions and stuff like that. And so, that might be an advantage that we have here in terms of the market share of the long tail is a lot smaller than the US. And if we have buy-in from the big ones in Canada, then we get a significant portion of the Canadian population that can actually access these fintech products and services. And so we should look to lean in on some of those advantages that we have, comparing ourselves to the US and also other jurisdictions, to really make a solution that works for us as Canadians.
And, we all appreciate that the long road ahead for the actual implementation of the system. But then at the same time, and Franklin mentioned some of the pragmatic approach as well, what do you see as ingredients of success for the implementation of a time-based and practical system, but also one that can be scaled? Franklin?
Sure. So the ingredients would be, in my mind, would be, it has to stay customer centric. So it's really what do customers see? And by customer, let's clarify. I think we mean consumers and businesses,
yes.
Small, medium businesses. The components are well known, right? The paper from the advisory committee does a great job mentioning them. Like it's about having a common standard. It's about having a common risk assessment framework, or we can call it accreditation. It's about having contracts or rules of the games that are common to the participants. It's really having a solution that, as a whole, it comes together as a solution that customers can embrace. But there are a few components here and there that needs to be clarified, and that the paper alludes to, and will have to be clarified as we implement. And so lots of the detailed questions. I think the devil is in details, but the components are pretty well known and articulated. And what was interesting is that for those who were in the consultation right before that paper was published, there was a bit of a consensus building, or we could see a convergence of viewpoints on a lot of these questions that were called out in the paper. So that gives me hope that we're not far at all from having an alignment and delivering a solution in the Canadian market.
Darren?
Yeah, so I'm an engineer by trade, so I'll probably give a very engineer answer, which is whatever we build, whatever we're thinking of, we should start small and think just very modular. And so, if we think about open banking solutions as a very broad term that can include everything and anything under the sun, it's really hard to see what problem we're actually solving for all the parties here, and as well as the consumers that we're trying to support. But if we think about them as modular, smaller problems that sort of build on top of each other, it makes the problems, a little bit easier to grasp and the solutions easier to see. And so what I really mean by that is, after, building on some of the core of what open banking is around, authentication and consent and those sort of mechanisms, that any problems we try to solve on top of that, it could be something around cardholder identity or access to transaction data or supporting the EFT infrastructure in Canada, should sort of be seen as independent problems with few dependencies between each other. And so, just taking a very iterative approach in solving these smaller problems, I think we can slowly start to chip away at the sort of solutions for the consumers that we're trying to solve, and just trying to get there one piece at a time.
So there's this approach, this modular approach that you're proposing, then it aligns with how the advisory committee is suggesting go read first and write later. Do you sort of agree with that as well?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I just love when we, I just love the modular approach to everything that I do. So that's the direction we're going. That's really, really great.
Saba?
Yeah, I think this is such a Canadian panel, because I'm just going to agree with Franklin and Darren. I really want to introduce something controversial, but I don't have one, because I agree. Like the beauty of a modular approach. Let's learn from our startup ecosystem. Let's do an MVP. We do not have to solve for everything, but there have to be some basic ingredients that do need to be in place that I think are really important, right? Like we can't just let everyone into participating into the ecosystem necessarily. So things around what might have to be considered for accreditation, but even that has to be, to Darren's point, modular and thought through. It has to be risk-based. If we're just assuming all data is the same and it needs to be treated the same, that's going to be unfortunate. It's going to take us far too long. So I think successful ingredients are very much about the hybrid approach. That's what we're here to talk about. What does the Made in Canada solution actually look like? But part of your question touched on scalability. And I think too often folks think that open banking is just a technological problem. It's not just a technological problem. It's an operational problem. It's a rules problem. And how are we going to go and address those things? How are we going to work together to move those forward? And that's where I think industry does have to take this on their shoulders and perhaps make some bets, educated bets, because to Franklin's point, the advisory committee report has done a very solid job just kind of laying out what needs to be in place. There are other jurisdictions who have already solved very similar problems. The ingredients that are, I think, low risk for us to take some of those bets on and move forward on, they already exist. And so I think that's going to be really important for us to be able to move in a timely manner. And then scalability comes through, like the lack of, I suppose, inefficiency in the ecosystem. Like how do we make that happen? How do we make sure that this collaboration is consistent, that there are standards, that is efficient, that people are spending their effort in the right places? And that's what's going to lead to scale. If we're all just connecting a million different ways, if we're all, applying our, different rules, that's not scale. Like that's just it's a network of a hodgepodge of a network, and it's going to lead to inefficiency. So we are going to scale by doing some of the work that the industry has already started to do and collaborate on things like standards and moving that forward.
And you touched, Saba, on the risk, which sort of brings us to the next question. As we implement open banking, we also need to ask ourselves if there could be a bridge too far. What do you think would be a bridge too far? Franklin?
Let's be, so I really like where you guys were, which is, and Darren, you talked about this engineer approach, modularized. So it's, let's build gradually. I feel this would be, I completely agree with that. And a bridge too far would be to go too fast. And so putting the system at risk, putting the outcome at risk by going too fast, too big, would be a bridge too far. And we've seen that in other markets where sometimes more sooner is not the best. And so I feel a gradual build is the way to go. The bridge too far would be to endanger, and you're asking me because I'm the banker here, but endanger the stability of the system overall. And beyond stability, it's trust into the system overall. The things we take for granted, trust people have in their bank, trust consumers have in their banks, or in the financial system in general in Canada, that's actually a distinctive feature of the Canadian market. We want to protect it and make sure we're not exposing ourselves collectively to some downfalls. It would be very detrimental if open banking gets a bad name, or if some incidents are showing or eroding that trust. And there are examples, not on open banking, but for instance, we're watching in the U.S. market the noise around ID.me, and it's used by certain government agencies. My concern is this could become a detractor to the development of digital identity in the U.S. market, and that would be very a bit of a shame. And so I hope that's the type of risks we have to keep in mind. And that would be a bridge too far. So I think the seeking speed, seeking convenience, and at the expense of the overall stability would be a bridge too far. And lastly, I can't resist that you were looking for controversy. You mentioned write versus read, and look, the advisory committee said let's do read before write. That's the right order. We want to. When we look at it, write raises a lot more questions beyond read, right? The ability to trigger a payment raises questions on fraud, on increased pressure on fraud, increased pressure on cybersecurity, liability, lots of questions that will have to be answered. And quite frankly, our view is this is what payments rails do. And so our first, naturally we see that happening on payments rails, not open banking, but I guess that's the controversy. I'll say I agree with going gradually and growing into things, not keep the more context for later.
Thank you, Darren.
Yeah, so as one of the people on the other side of the bridge, I think oftentimes we don't go far enough. But I really agree with what Franklin says. What the bridge too far is whatever we've done, it could come in many forms, but if we lose the trust of the end user, of the consumers, then that means we've gone too far. And so, what that could mean is going too fast, but it could also mean by going too fast, we've forgotten about some of the core tenets of why we're introducing open banking and focusing on what can be achieved instead. So, what I really think that could be is really just centered around security, privacy, but it's also, in terms of fintech adoption, there's going to be a lot of great products and services that come out of this, but there's also going to be some that we need to make sure we have a control over or understand how open banking technologies can be done to create these services and products so as not to in any way take advantage of consumer trust and eventually somehow be losing it. And so whatever that is, we can't lose the trust of the consumers around these open banking solutions, or else it's going to be a tough thing to recover from.
That's a very good point. We often talk about the challenges of going too fast, but there's obviously the challenges of going too slow in such a way that screen scraping perhaps becomes enshrined in people's psyche, and they don't see an issue with it. So such that when you actually implement a system, will they come? So they both clearly do pose their challenges as well. Saba?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned that, Parna, because by some estimates, 4 million Canadians have already made that decision to share their data in that manner. And so I think what I'm kind of taking away from this discussion is we need a bridge. We know what the bridge too far is. It is anything that engenders or takes away from trust with the consumer, that puts their data at any further risk, because it's not so much that open banking is the cause of it. It is that it does create new vulnerability points. And those are the things that we're trying to address, in that the data does go into places that perhaps, aren't necessarily controlled, aren't applying the same rules of customer care that you have when, from the source data aspect of it. So if we're trying to actually make that better, a bridge too far is anything that maybe does go too fast and doesn't keep that in mind, the security risk and the fraud risk. You now just have more points of vulnerability, and just given the prevalence of state actors and cyber threats in this world, and that risk, I don't think we want to do anything that makes that any worse for consumers. And it's not just consumers. We talked about small businesses. This can take a good chunk out of the economy and put a lot of folks at risk. So I think we're all in alignment that is a bridge too far, anything that puts that at further risk. But I like the concept of now it looks like we have to actually build a bridge, and that's what we're going to go do.
Indeed. And, we've been discussing open banking for quite a while now. And throughout those discussions, there's been many times perhaps where many believe that not everyone is interested in seeing it being implemented. And I won't, look at Franklin in this case. But often that has been the perception that, banks versus fintechs versus other players and so on. But it's been many years now. What would you say that now at this stage are all the stakeholders in? Darren, what is your view on this?
Yeah, so using that same analogy, I think I'll know that all the stakeholders are all in when I see all the chips in the pot. When there's something to show for it, when we actually see one of these APIs out in the wild. What I will say is that just in the last 6 months, compared to the 7 or so years that I've been doing this, we've seen more movement in the open banking space and more evidence of commitment from all the parties involved. And so, I really like seeing that. I think all the signs there are good and moving in the right direction. That can't have happened without some form of buy-in from all of the stakeholders. And so, as one of these fintechs that are really, really rooting for us to have open banking across Canada, it's just super exciting to see. But when I see it, I'll know, and that'll make me a lot more happy then.
Saba?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, I would agree with Darren. We've seen more, not just have conversation, but more, let's say, purposeful conversation that's resulting in real things happening. And so for me, it's as well less about are the other stakeholders all in, because I do actually see the benefit of working with many sides of that equation, whether they be large banks, credit unions, fintechs, and hearing from them. And I can say they're all in. They're just right now what we often debate is what's the method, what's the first step, how do we go do it? And so you are going to need to work together, and folks are going to have to bring those along. So the stakeholder conversations that I have are less again about are they all in? They're about, well, what does this mean to me? What do I do? Like, what's next? What's the right first thing to do? And so you can. The advisory committee report lays out a whole bunch of things, but there's still a lot of unknowns. And when you actually get into the weeds of the customer experience in terms of granting consent and what is that going to look like, what does the language need to, include, there's a level of detail that's not just going to exist in the advisory committee report, nor was it intended to. And so there are a lot of unknowns. So as much as the stakeholders would like to be in, I think there is some hope that some of this stuff does get decided. And that's, I do think, where industry is working together to help decide some of that stuff. And ideally in a very collaborative way that is very inclusive.
That's a very good point. Franklin?
Yeah, so I'm glad Darren, you're picking up on that. Like, I agree. The industry is evolving, and we're seeing a lot of momentum. In fact, I've never seen. I share your view. I've never seen as much momentum as we have now than as we've had before. And crucially, from inside the banks, what's interesting is, and I'm going to talk for TD here, but I'm sure it's the same across. A lot of business leaders started this journey in denial. Why are we doing this? What's in it for us? It's not going to help us. And nowadays, most leaders are actually intrigued by how can this help us all improve our customers' experiences? How can we add more value to customers? And we actually may leverage open banking and equivalent to add more value. So people are really understanding and are starting to see that this is going to be an opportunity, not just a constraint or a cost. And that's, to me, that is a sign of maturity in the thinking, and that kind of supports the momentum. We're seeing a lot of conversations, very active conversations on what is the solution. To your point, Saba, what's the solution? How do we do it? And I see that conversation across large FIs, banks, credit unions, and fintechs as well. Lots of dialogue, and so I'm hopeful. And interestingly, the date of early 2023, as written, as you guys know, in the report, is actually triggering people to say, well, that's the deadline. Let's get there. How do we get there? And that's creating a healthy tension, a healthy pressure to push everyone to deliver there.
And as we look forward to that, I'm going to ask you to paint a picture, perhaps, as to what success will actually look like. Saba, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. The crystal ball, the wish list, all those things. I think success is a lot of the things that we talked about earlier in the panel today. And I definitely agree with Franklin in that success is organizations not being afraid of open banking. It's embracing the opportunity that it provides, and success is leveraging the learnings from open banking to get to more of a universal understanding of customer data rights, of a digital economy, of less friction in the ecosystem, the ability for me to decide what to do, who to do it with, and how to do it with the right safeguards and controls in place. So success is us implementing very much what we've talked about today, a made in Canada approach. I don't think we have to do what's happened in heavily regulated markets. I don't think those same conditions exist here. I think we very much have the opportunity to collaborate. And so success is something that takes less time, costs less money, and at the end of the day does deliver value to customers, and does so in a time frame that is hopefully soon. Like 18 months isn't actually that long away. It sounds like a long time, but given all the work that actually has to be done, Darren's earlier point, to see one of the APIs that folks are working on, that they are testing, that they are designing, having it actually live and running, in a Canadian ecosystem with large financial institutions, medium financial institutions, fintechs. That's success. That's the technical element of success, but the design around that, the operations around that, I think is super key as well. And so that will all happen if all those ingredients come together and come together in a meaningful way. And we're not talking about that long. So I think it's pretty exciting to say that in 18 months or less, we expect to be there.
Thank you. Darren?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, success is really driven by continued buy-in from all parties. And so if we have any of our stakeholders that feel that, hey, this isn't something that we don't want to necessarily invest in as much or something like that, that's when we're starting to move off the path towards success. And so really we want to make sure that all parties, all stakeholders in this open banking conversation are aligned moving forward over at least the next 18 months, but obviously further into the future, in a way that drives consumer trust and adoption into it and really start to feed into itself. And so success for me, outside of actually having a solution, is to make sure that at all times in the process, we have alignment, buy-in from everyone that has a voice here.
Franklin?
Well, I'm gonna talk in KPIs. I've got 3 KPIs in my mind for success. One is elimination of screen scraping, or more specifically of credential sharing. This is something that we can't continue to have. It's putting the whole system at risk. And so to me, that's the key criteria: elimination of credential sharing. 2 is delivering in early 2023 the first module, an MVP, getting the Canadian market open to open banking in early 2023. That's going to be my second KPI. And the third one, which is actually probably the most important one, is consumer adoption. So as we roll out, it's not build it and it will come. It's let's build it in a way that drives adoption. And that means enabling innovation, creativity, enabling solutions to be developed easily and safely, such that consumers see value in it and adopt open banking and have a large volume over time. These are the 3 KPIs I would hold ourselves accountable to.
All 3 of you are very ambitious, and I look forward to all of that being implemented. And with that, we're going to open it up to the audience question. Our first question: we often look at the UK, Europe, or Australia for examples that serve a made in Canada approach, but are we doing open banking a disservice by not looking to the US? Progress through bilateral agreements, pragmatic, interim approach to screen scraping, and adoption of modern APIs. Who wants to take that one? And we've touched already some of that as well as we talked about the US a little bit.
I'm happy to go ahead, Saba.
No, I see you starting. I'll go after you. I'm happy to.
Well, I was going to say, great question, and I completely agree. So first of all, let's remember, like I said, we need to be interoperable with the US. This is the nature of our country, the nature of our industry. And yes, the US is a very interesting model where adoption is there, and yet there is no regulation, little framework. The industry has come together and has delivered build a standard, build a risk assessment template that is fairly robust, has developed through bilateral contracts, etc. So it's a very pragmatic and interesting role model. Is it perfect? Probably not. Is it what Canada exactly needs? No, we need a Canadian solution. We all agree on that. But it is a very pragmatic way of looking at things. So it's a good source of inspiration, I would say. I would completely agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree with Franklin, because I hope that's maybe the takeaway from this panel, is that we are saying that we are probably less looking to the UK model or the Australia model necessarily. We think that there's an opportunity very much in Canada, and I do agree with Franklin what the US has done. Why I mentioned the Singapore model is I think that's like a bit of the icing on the cake. It's the appropriate level of support from regulatory authorities to help enable that to happen, but also to encourage it to happen. And that's, I think, what's going to be necessary. I think another maybe gap in the US market would be just the regulations at the end of the day. So it's not an uneven playing field, but very much you have market driven without any regulations. Folks are sharing data. There are bilateral agreements. Now, how do you make that effective and efficient so that there aren't a million different bilateral agreements with different terms and different treatments of liability? That's the key. And I think that's the add-on that we have to consider in the Canadian market.
Yeah, and I think what I mentioned earlier is on the fintech side of it, there's things that the US are doing that are actually really good for us as a fintech. The big banks there have introduced open banking APIs for us to access, and we access it through various means. But there's also things that are not working for us as a fintech. So I think it's really just important to learn from the US. It's not saying that we're not learning from the US, but there's going to be things that work for us here and things that don't work for us. And so some of that adoption from the long tail that I've mentioned would have probably been improved by having more regulation. And so it's obviously going to be something in the middle that works for us.
Our next question, can there be a dialogue on profitability and maximizing shareholder value to your FI partners? To collaborate in open banking is to capitalize on a market inefficiency. Is burn rate a large factor to consider in choosing to solve a problem, or does return on investment drive more urgency in your decision making? That's a very long question. Is there one that perhaps you do want to take, Franklin?
It's a tricky one.
It is tricky.
I don't think I'm going to do it justice, but I would say open banking is removing friction out of the system, and is by making data more available, more shared, more democratized. We're enabling more solutions, more value-add solutions, more intelligence deployment, and ultimately better user experience, better value to customers. And so that's the lever I see in open banking, decreasing the friction of the system and enabling solutions. As for ROI, I'm not sure I'm clear on the question. I feel it's by enabling a workable solution on open banking, we're enabling that innovation to take place, that value creation to take place. That's how I think about it.
Thank you. There's another question to solve incumbents and fintechs. Are the incumbents ready for open banking? Do they have an API framework in place to support data interchange? Without this, I think the question cut off. But some of that, I think that's the whole idea of the open banking system that we're going to implement, such that to address some of this. But I don't think there's an expectation necessarily everyone here to already have the framework in place. But happy to one of you if you want to take it as well.
This is largely a question of sort of asking if the incumbents actually have the APIs. And I think there have been some bilaterals that are in place that we have seen for sure. But I think this is exactly what everyone's working on. There's a reason why organizations started to collaborate on standards like FTX. It's to be able to solve some of the hard questions about what should be included, what shouldn't be included, what's appropriate for the Canadian market. So I think to your point, Parna, we're starting with the design, and now that design is leading to, actual testing and actual implementation, because that has to be the key. So these, to your point, the systems were not designed and developed today to deliver the data in the manner that it's being requested to support open banking. That's just not what they were set up to do.
And it would not necessarily be productive to do it in a 5-by-5 basis. We need something,
need something
standardized to be able to actually roll it out properly.
Exactly, because that's a challenge, I suppose, that Darren and his organization might face if it is so inconsistent or not there.
Another question, I think the market industry will drive Canada's open banking ecosystem and push the government along, I hope. My question is, which group or association do you feel is best poised to bring the industry together? Example, FDX.
It's an interesting question. I can start on this one. So it's a great question because there is no obvious group in the industry today that captures all the viewpoints and alignment on this. FDX is an interesting forum in that these two solitudes, like it was called earlier, are represented. And so you hear the various voices. But FDX is not a policy instrument. FDX is a technical standard, and it intends to stay there. So it is not the place to solve the harder questions that policy and that the industry will want to solve. So right now, I would say I would argue there is no obvious forum or organization that is capturing these. And that may be something that Abraham and folks will solve in the coming months. I don't know if you folks have different views, Darren and Saba.
Yeah, no, nothing really stands out as the leader or anything of a group that's sort of bringing the industry together. So there might be a gap there that we can help to solve. But I think just really important to acknowledge that this is not happening without all of these parties communicating in some way. Albeit right now there isn't a leader in the group to do that, but we need to constantly be keeping the conversation going between all the different stakeholders just to make sure that we've got all our bases covered and we're not moving too fast on it.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, to Darren's point, I think there's necessarily even that there's just a single leader. There will be elements where organizations do need to lead and help. And so the earlier one that I talked about, where people are like, I don't know what to do. Should I start building my APIs? What standard should I follow? Or assuming that there is going to be a single standard, because I'm been in the industry too long in payments to see that unfortunately there are just, as much as people try, there are natural differences just based on different systems and ecosystem. So I do think that there isn't, to the earlier point, a single maybe organization, but there will be folks who will have to solve specific needs, and then you build on it. You're creating almost a network of leaders in this space, building on what FTX is doing, building on what Abraham's going to go do, building what organizations like we're doing with the industry to help put real things in motion and test things. So I think it's probably going to mix of those organizations continuing to work together.
There's another question in respect of the Brazilian implementation of open banking, and if we look at it, why as Canadians are we concerned? So the assumption that the Brazilian model is successful. Any thoughts on that? Our last question.
Well, so I think the concerns, maybe I'll not talk about the Brazilian model for a second, but it's more about the fear that we have is that we don't want to repeat the sins that have happened elsewhere. So if there are lessons to be learned in moving fast, testing, and not, at the end of the day, the adoption has to be greater than it's been in other markets. There was a lot of money spent and a lot of time taken and not a lot of uptake in the early years. We're in a different spot. So I think the fears are less about maybe that. It's about what's happened when there's been an overly prescriptive or mandated approach.
We're unfortunately running out of time. Darren, Saba, Franklin, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. And I very much look forward to continuing this discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.